day, when the palace corridors were filled with the hollow echoes of the guards' footsteps, Philip II felt the true emptiness of power for the first time, even though he still held the throne. His body trembled, the skin on his hands and feet was covered with patches of rot, and the sores on his back and thighs grew larger, emitting a sharp, almost unbearable odor. The servants whispered quietly behind his back, every glance at him accompanied by shudders and disgust. He tried to maintain the appearance of a king, but the pain emanating from his groin was unbearable. His penis, damaged and cut off on the orders of a secret group of courtiers, was a source of constant heat and bleeding. Every morning brought new torments. Philip's pulse was barely perceptible, his tongue was dry and blotchy, his urine was cloudy and had a pungent odor. Fever was followed by chills, and his body was gradually losing its ability to move. Light moans interrupted his thoughts about the state and the will that was supposed to preserve order after his death. Every doctor who entered the chambers recorded his condition in notes: pulse 3 times a day, temperature, skin color and smell, degree of discharge, condition of ulcers. Leeches were placed on his thighs and stomach. Bloodletting was performed in small portions twice a week, and moxibustion was performed on his chest and lower back. Ointments made from honey and herbs were applied 3 times a day. Opium was given in small doses at dawn, and 2 spoonfuls of poppy syrup at night. Herbal compresses were changed every 30 minutes and held for up to an hour to reduce the sharp pain. The fear of God's judgment intensified his paranoia. He confessed daily, but doubts about the forgiveness of his sins never left him. He demanded that every prayer be said strictly according to schedule, watching the priests who humbly bowed their heads. Sometimes his hallucinations brought to life images of the execution of heretics, and he saw his own organs turn into objects of torture, his body, where once his penis had been, becoming a source of pain and fear. A power struggle was raging in the palace corridors. The old nobility tried to restrict access to Philip, and changing guards watched everyone who dared to enter. Secret notes, reports, and whispers from servants recorded every movement: who served the dishes, who checked the wine, who tried to rewrite the seals on documents. Only his closest advisors were allowed to enter his chambers, and their every step was monitored. The conspirators discussed changes in policy, the influence of the French and English ambassadors, and planned how they would benefit from the king's death. Despite his physical exhaustion, Philip continued to issue orders, sign documents, and check reports, but his face grew pale, his eyes clouded over, his vision partially failed, and the smell of a rotting body filled the chambers. Servants noted in their diaries how his heels cracked, how his sores became covered with scabs, how traces of urine remained on the felt. Every nightly rounds were accompanied by tension and fear of the king's wrath, who was still capable of action, even though his body was gradually turning into a shell of torment. His moral decay went hand in hand with his physical decline. Paranoia grew, trust in those closest to him disappeared, and fear of traitors took hold of his mind. He suspected everyone, even his closest servants, of trying to change his will or forge his will. A struggle was raging inside his mind, the desire to live against unbearable pain, fear of sins and God's judgment, and the realization that no one could save his body and soul. And although death had not yet come, the palace already sensed the approach of the end. Rumors, reports, and whispered gossip filled the corridors as Philip continued to exist in a state of agonizing decay, ruling the country through his agony, but increasingly isolated from the world he had once ruled with absolute power. With each passing day, Philip II's agony became more palpable. The chambers were filled with a thick smell of decay emanating from the monarch's body, from the wounds on his thighs and back, and from the groin area where his penis had been forcibly removed by servants on the orders of a secret group of courtiers. Blood, oozing from the torn flesh, left traces on the sheets and blankets, causing the servants to flinch with every step they took. Philip tried to control the situation, but his body would not obey him. The ulcers grew larger, the scabs cracked, and a putrid smell mixed with the odor of old sweat spread through the corridors, causing panic and horror among all who entered the chambers. His sleep was fitful, with chills alternating with fever, his head spinning, his tongue dry, and his pulse weak and irregular. The doctors recorded everything: skin color, smell, temperature, condition of the ulcers. Leeches were applied to his thighs and forearms for 20 minutes at a time. Bloodletting was performed in small portions 3 times a week, and cauterization was applied to specific points on his chest and shoulders. Ointments made from herbs and honey were applied 4 times a day. Opium was given in small doses at dawn, and 2 spoonfuls of poppy syrup at night. Herbal compresses were changed every 30 minutes and held for up to an hour to reduce the unbearable pain. Philip still tried to speak, sign documents, and participate in meetings, but his speech became intermittent, his eyes cloudy. He often lost himself in thought, heard whispers and hallucinations, as if the walls of his chambers were whispering of betrayal. Servants whispered, discussing the king's discontent and the conspirators' plans. Every day was a test for them. They were afraid to touch the king's body, afraid of his anger and contagious smell, but they had to follow orders, or else they could be punished right away. At this time, palace intrigues were raging. The old nobility sought to dictate the terms of succession and control the drafting of the will, while the new entourage tried to impose its own conditions. The ambassadors of France and England took part in secret negotiations, trying to use the king's condition to their advantage. Access to the chambers was strictly regulated by changing guards. The keys were kept by the closest courtiers, and secret passages were used for clandestine meetings and discussions of plans. Everyone who entered the chambers was recorded in diaries, noting who served the food, who tasted the wine, and who replaced the seals in order to control information. Philip's illness did not spare his organs. His removed penis remained a source of constant purulent inflammation. His wounds did not heal, and the mucous membranes of his groin were in a state of decay. Philip felt a burning pain at the slightest movement, and every attempt to sit or lie down was accompanied by screams and moans that shook the palace walls. He tried to maintain the appearance of a monarch, but his body betrayed him. The vagina and penis, left with the servants during the rituals of control and humiliation, brought back painful memories, intensifying his moral decay. The religious situation remained tense. Philip went to confession every day, but his doubts about the forgiveness of his sins and his fear of God's judgment grew. He demanded that prayers be said strictly according to schedule, watching the priests, whose obedience became mandatory, and the slightest delay was perceived as a challenge. Hallucinations made him see scenes of heretics being executed and the betrayal of his own bodyguards. Servants noted in their diaries how his sores were covered with scabs, how the cracks on his heels were deepening, and how traces of urine and blood left an unpleasant smell on the felt. Nightly rounds were tense. Every step the guards took could provoke an outburst of rage from Philip, who continued to issue orders, even as his body lost the ability to move. The servants quietly discussed who among them would survive, and who would pay for the slightest mistake, as they watched the king's condition deteriorate. Paranoia and moral decay intensified, along with physical suffering. Philip suspected everyone around him, and saw conspiracies even when they did not exist. Each new symptom, worsening ulcers, the smell of a rotting body, inability to control his muscles, became proof of betrayal. He still issued orders, tried to dictate his will and control state affairs, but every day became more painful and isolated. His suffering, creeping along with intrigue and fear, slowly destroyed palace life. The old courtiers tried to maintain order, while the new ones sought to take advantage of the king's weakness. Every night was filled with secret meetings, fear of possible assassinations, forgery of documents, and attempts to change Philip's last will. Rumors spread about new alliances and betrayals that could shake the state after the monarch's death, but Philip remained alive, tormented, and terribly weak, still capable of instilling fear, even though he could no longer enjoy the power that had once belonged to him entirely. With each new morning, Philip's condition worsened. The ulcers grew, bled, and oozed pus, mixing with sweat and soaking into the sheets and blankets. The groin area, where his penis had been forcibly removed, became a source of constant pain and infection. He still had power in words. He gave orders, signed papers, but his hands trembled, his eyes clouded over, and his body was covered with patches of rotting skin. Any movement caused piercing moans that made the servants shudder. The decay penetrated deeper. His internal organs resisted, his stomach failed, and his weakness grew. Servants and courtiers were now afraid to even stand near him. Their whispers filled the chambers, discussing every detail of the monarch's condition. Who tasted the food, who checked the wine, who replaced the seals. Everything was secretly recorded, for everyone believed that the king's weakness opened up opportunities for personal gain. Secret passages were used more often to hide meetings of conspirators, with the old nobility and the new entourage fighting for control over future power. The ambassadors of Spain and France recorded the monarch's condition in their reports, waiting for a convenient moment to influence the succession to the throne. Medical procedures became increasingly exhausting and frequent. Leeches were now placed on the thighs and shoulders for 40 minutes. Small amounts of blood were drawn daily, and cauterization was performed twice a day on specific points on the chest and arms. Ointments made from honey, herbs, and resins were applied every 3 hours. Opium was given in small doses at dawn and sunset, and 2 spoonfuls of poppy syrup were administered in the morning and evening. Herbal compresses were changed every 20 minutes and kept on for hours, but they provided only temporary relief. Philip gradually lost control of his bladder, and his arms and legs became weak and unresponsive. The stench of death, rotting wounds, and the groin area spread through the corridors, forcing the courtiers to keep their distance. Even those who remained loyal felt disgust and fear, but he continued to issue orders, tried to dictate the terms of his will, and demanded daily confessions, in which he doubted whether he believed in forgiveness. Paranoia reached its peak. Hallucinations and delusions haunted him day and night. He saw the shadow of traitors, heard the whispers of priests insulting him, and suffered from visions of the executions of heretics whom he had condemned while still alive. He still understood that he was losing control, but every order and every movement of his lips gave the illusion of power. He even suspected his closest associates of planting false reports or plotting his murder, and every sound behind the door of his chambers was perceived as a conspiracy. Palace intrigues developed unabated. His new entourage tried to impose their terms on his will, while the old nobility manipulated documents, forged signatures, and secretly gathered support from ambassadors and supporters of the hard line. Guards took turns monitoring all entrances and exits, but everyone understood that the monarch's weakness paved the way for future chaos. Anyone could come under suspicion and become a victim of intrigue or deception. Every day of his suffering, every cry of pain in his groin, every whisper of the servants discussing his mutilated body, intensified the atmosphere of horror. He was rotting alive, but his fear of death and God's judgment kept his mind alert. He saw his body failing him, his internal organs giving out, ulcers spreading across his thighs and back, scabs cracking open, and the smell of decay becoming unbearable. At this time, the people and foreign ambassadors began to realize the monarch's condition. Whispers about his painful illness and slow decay spread throughout Spain and beyond. Fear of his possible death and the consequences for the government forced people to seek protection from new influential courtiers and conspirators. Every letter, every rumor about Philip's condition became a tool for manipulation and political maneuvering. Meanwhile, religious tensions were growing. Philip still demanded daily confession, but his doubts about the forgiveness of his sins grew stronger. He dreamed of the punishments that awaited him after death, and saw scenes in which his soul was tormented for his sins, including the violent removal of his penis. Every thought of God's judgment intensified his fear, but at the same time made him more demanding of his subordinates and courtiers. His physical suffering intensified, intrigues boiled, paranoia grew, and Philip's body was almost completely overcome by disease. He could still give orders, observe, and control events, but this was only a shadow of his former power, and the rest was just a painful existence. Philip's body now barely obeyed him. Half blind, he could barely make out the faces of his courtiers, but he could hear their whispers and the creaking of their footsteps, which intensified his paranoia. Every movement of his servants caused a sudden attack of fear. It seemed as if they had woven a web of conspiracy around his bed. Ulcers spread across his back and sides, and the groin area, where his penis had been forcibly removed, became a source of constant, excruciating pain. Pus oozed continuously, and blood mixed with sweat and secretions, leaving stains on the sheets and felt. The scabs on the sores cracked, and the smell of rot spread through the rooms, forcing only the most loyal and at the same time most timid servants to approach. Philip continued to issue orders, but every word was forced out through gritted teeth, accompanied by grinding and moaning. He dictated his will, demanded corrections, and suspected everyone who approached the papers or tried to write down his words. The guards now restricted access to the king with particular cruelty. Shifts were reinforced, keys were kept by the chief courtiers, secret passages were monitored, and even ambassadors had to wait for hours before being allowed into the rooms. Medical procedures became daily torture. Leeches were now placed on his thighs, back, and chest for 45 minutes, and bloodletting took place twice a day in small portions. Cauterization was performed 3 times a day on specific points on his arms, chest, and legs. Ointments made from herbs, resin, and honey were applied every 2 hours, and opium and poppy syrup were given at strictly defined times. Herbal compresses were changed every 20 minutes and kept on for hours, but the relief was only brief. His tongue was coated, his pulse weakened, his body wasted away, and his sweat left wet patches on the felt, while his urine left traces on the bedding. The courtiers now kept their distance. Their whispers became almost constant, discussing every sigh, every groan, every wrong look from the king. The new entourage and the old nobility fought for control over future power, falsifying records and reports, changing signatures, secretly gathering support from ambassadors and supporters of the hard line. Any mistake or wrong word could cost a life, but even so, Philip continued to influence decisions, demanding reports and orders. Paranoia and hallucinations reached their peak. Philip saw traitors who did not exist and heard the whispers of angels and devils at the same time. He dreamed of scenes of executions of heretics whom he had condemned during his lifetime, saw his own servants preparing his torture and betrayal. Religious fear intensified his torment. Confession and communion became a daily routine, but doubts about forgiveness gnawed at his soul. Every mention of God's judgment caused him to tremble with fear, but he still tried to keep the court intrigues under control. Philip's influence on the political situation remained significant. He signed documents through his assistants, dictated the terms of his will, and interfered in matters of executions and pardons, but his weakness and the stench of decay caused many courtiers to ignore his orders or forge them. Intrigues grew. The old nobility and the new entourage fought for the inheritance. Ambassadors watched every move, and the fear of the king's possible death hung over the palace like a dark cloud. His physical suffering intensified, ulcers on his sides and back, the groin area where his penis had been removed, which never stopped bleeding, pus, and the smell of decay became unbearable. His skin was covered with spots, and cracks on his heels and hands threatened infection. Every movement caused piercing moans, and the pain refused to subside even with opium. Philip could barely hold himself up in bed, straps and pillows holding him in place to prevent him from falling. Every day, every hour of his existence was filled with horror. The servants were afraid to touch him, the ambassadors were afraid to look at him, and the courtiers whispered about the future. But even in this state, Philip remained the center of power, capable of dictating the course of events. His paranoia, fear of God's judgment, and physical suffering created an aura of terror that kept everyone around him at bay. Philip could no longer speak or think clearly. His body had finally betrayed him. Half blind from pain, disfigured and decaying, he lay on a bed covered with patches of rot, blood, and pus. Straps held him up to prevent him from falling, but even that could not stop the tremors and convulsions. The groin area, where his penis had been forcibly removed, continued to exude excruciating pain, mixed with the remnants of inflammation and festering wounds, and the smell of decay spread throughout the room. The ulcers on his back, sides, and legs cracked open, the scabs flew off, and every moan shook the walls, causing the servants to shudder. On that day, Philip could no longer hold on to power. Any order went unheeded, the servants were afraid to approach him, and the courtiers secretly forged documents and reports, deciding the future without his participation. The old nobility and the new entourage entered into an open dispute for control of the throne, while the ambassadors watched, preparing their petitions and agreements. Every movement of his body, every attempt to sit up or move, caused excruciating pain and weakness. Medical procedures no longer provided relief. Leeches, ointments, herbal compresses, and opium only delayed the inevitable. His pulse weakened with every passing minute. His tongue was dry and coated with a purulent film. His breathing became intermittent and wheezing. Servants tried to clean the sheets and change the pillows, but the putrid smell and sight of the decomposing body were unbearable. Philip tried painfully to utter words, reaching for the papers to correct his will, but his hand would not obey him. His thoughts were confused. He saw scenes of execution, betrayal, and divine judgment in his dreams, and heard the whispers of angels and devils. Every memory of power and greatness contrasted with the humiliation and pain that accompanied his last hours. When the end came, his breathing became rare and intermittent. Servants and courtiers, afraid to touch him, stood at a distance. Guards blocked the passageways so that no one would disturb the moment. Ambassadors took notes, and old intrigues quietly faded away in the silence of the chambers. Philip's death was long, painful, and humiliating. The body that had decayed during his lifetime now ceased to exist as a symbol of power. The consequences were immediate. Power was contested. Courtiers and ambassadors began to manipulate the will and the terms of succession to the throne. The old nobility and the new entourage clashed in a struggle for influence. Spain plunged into a period of uncertainty and political intrigue, with fear of the former tyranny mixed with horror at the king's death. The people, priests, and foreign ambassadors were aware of the contrast between Philip's greatness and the horror of his last hours, creating an atmosphere of anxiety, doubt, and anticipation of a new order. The grim chronicle of Philip II's last months and days left an indelible mark. Political struggle flared up with renewed vigor, and fear of disease, decay, and mortal infirmity intensified the mystical horror surrounding power. The king, who rotted alive, became an example of how the physical destruction of the body and moral decay can overturn the destinies of states and people, leaving behind chaos and fear, in which human weakness and ambition clash in the most terrible way.